He had been told America was soft. He had been told that a nation built on comfort and capitalism would crack under the pressure of real war. Then the ship docked, and the guards handed him a paycheck. It was 1943. The prisoner's name was among thousands: German soldiers, Afrika Korps veterans, men who had fought Rommel's war across the North African sand, and they had just arrived in the United States as prisoners of war. They expected cages. They expected punishment. What they found was something that haunted them for the rest of their lives. What did a man do with that feeling? This is the story of what the enemy admitted, when no one was supposed to be listening. The Afrika Korps soldiers who arrived on American soil in 1943 came from a specific kind of defeat. They had fought under Erwin Rommel in North Africa, a campaign the Germans had believed in deeply. Rommel himself had been a figure of near mythological confidence, the desert fox, the general who moved faster than his enemies could think. And yet by May 1943, the campaign was over. More than 250,000 Axis troops surrendered in Tunisia, and a significant portion of them were German. The men who crossed the Atlantic as prisoners carried a particular psychological weight. They had not been captured in a rout of cowardice. Many of them had fought hard, believed in what they were fighting for, and still lost. That distinction mattered to them. It shaped how they processed everything that came next. The Atlantic crossing itself was disorienting. These were men accustomed to the desert heat, to the rhythm of mobile warfare, to the sound of artillery rolling across open ground. Now they were on American transport ships, moving toward a continent most of them had never seen, a country they had been taught to regard as decadent and militarily shallow. German propaganda had painted the United States as a land of Hollywood and jazz, culturally chaotic, racially mixed in ways the Nazi ideology condemned, and fundamentally incapable of producing the kind of disciplined soldier that Germany had spent a decade building. They arrived expecting to confirm that picture. The country they stepped into did not cooperate. The prisoner of war camps that received German soldiers across the United States were, by almost any measure, not what the prisoners had anticipated. The facilities operated under the Geneva Convention, the international agreement governing the treatment of prisoners of war, and the United States took that obligation seriously, in part for legal reasons, in part because American prisoners in German hands might benefit from reciprocal treatment, and in part because of a genuine institutional belief that humane treatment was the correct policy. What this meant in practice was that the camps had mess halls with food that, by the account of many prisoners, exceeded what German soldiers had been eating in the field. They had medical care. They had recreational facilities. Some camps had theaters, libraries, and sports fields. The men could write letters home. They were not free, but they were not suffering in the way that the word prisoner implied to a soldier who had grown up under a government that routinely described its enemies as subhuman. Imagine what he saw: a man raised on the imagery of American weakness, walking into a camp that was cleaner, better supplied, and more orderly than many of the forward positions he had occupied in North Africa. The cognitive dissonance was immediate and, for some men, genuinely troubling. A belief system does not collapse all at once. It develops fractures, and the first fracture often appeared somewhere between the mess hall and the bunk. But the dissonance deepened further when the work began. The labor program that put German prisoners to work on American farms operated under a specific legal framework. The Geneva Convention permitted prisoner labor, provided the prisoners were compensated and not put to work in direct support of military operations. The United States complied with this by paying prisoners 80 cents a day, a modest wage, but a wage nonetheless. 80 cents. In 1943 and 1944, that was real money by the standards of a man who had nothing. Prisoners could spend it at camp canteens on small luxuries: cigarettes, soap, extra food, writing materials. The wage was not charity. It was a transaction, and the deliberateness of that transaction unsettled some prisoners more than the imprisonment itself had. The work they were sent to do was agricultural. American farms, particularly in the South and Southwest, were facing severe labor shortages because the men who would normally have worked those fields were now wearing American uniforms in Europe and the Pacific. German prisoners filled the gap. They picked cotton in Texas. They harvested sugar beets in Nebraska. They worked citrus groves in Florida and apple orchards in the Northeast. At the height of the program, there were roughly 425,000 German prisoners of war in the United States, held in over 500 camps scattered across the country, and a substantial number of them were doing farm work that kept American food production running. The farmers who worked alongside them, or who watched them work from a distance, often reported something unexpected. The Germans were, by and large, good workers. They were disciplined, they understood agricultural labor from their own rural backgrounds, and many of them took a kind of quiet pride in doing the work well. Pride in craft, even in captivity, even for the enemy's harvest. That detail stays with you. The farm work gave German prisoners something that camp life alone could not: direct, unmediated contact with American civilian reality. They worked in American fields, ate at American tables in some cases, and looked out at an American landscape that was utterly unlike what they had been told. They saw a country that was not cracking. They saw farms that were productive even with their labor force depleted. They saw organization, infrastructure, material abundance, the roads, the machinery, the sheer physical scale of the American interior. A prisoner transferred from a camp in Arizona to one in Virginia passed through a country that seemed, from the back of a transport truck, to go on forever. The psychological effect of that geography on men from a country the size of Texas was not trivial. Some prisoners began, carefully and privately, to revise their mental model of the enemy they had been fighting. The revision was rarely announced. It was the kind of thinking a man did quietly, at night, writing a letter he wasn't sure would reach home. But it happened. It accumulated. Remember what he believed at the start? That America was soft, shallow, incapable of real industrial war? Here is where it begins to break. The breaking was not dramatic. It was the accumulation of small, undeniable things: the quality of the food, the condition of the roads, the number of trucks, the fact that a country at war could afford to pay its prisoners and still keep its farms running. Hit subscribe right now, because what these men admitted when they finally spoke openly about what they had seen, that confession changes the entire picture of how Germany understood the war it was losing. Do not go anywhere. The letters that German prisoners sent home from American camps were censored on both ends, read by American military authorities before dispatch, and subject to scrutiny by German authorities when they arrived. This meant that prisoners were careful, but careful is not the same as dishonest, and the things they chose to write, even under those constraints, revealed the shape of what they were thinking. Some men described the food in terms their families at home, increasingly subject to wartime rationing, would have found almost incomprehensible. Some described the physical scale of American infrastructure with a kind of reluctant wonder. The word that appeared, in various forms, across prisoner accounts was staunen. Astonishment. A low, disbelieving, unsettling astonishment. What they could not write directly, they sometimes wrote around. A man might describe a drive through the American countryside without explicit comment, trusting that his brother or his father would understand what the description implied. This country is not what we were told. This country is enormous. This country is not losing. There were also moments of friction that tell their own story. Some prisoners refused to work. Some organized small acts of resistance within the camps. A few held hard to the ideology they had brought with them, and the camps were not free of the internal politics of the Nazi system. Senior prisoners sometimes enforced conformity on younger ones, and men who seemed to warm too visibly to their American environment could face pressure from their fellow prisoners. The camp was not a paradise. It was a compressed, complicated human world. But even among those who resisted the emotional reality of what they were seeing, the material evidence accumulated. You cannot pick cotton in a Texas field for 6 months and walk away believing that the country whose harvest you helped bring in is about to collapse. The relationship between German prisoners and American civilian workers, the farmers, the foremen, the local families, was governed by regulations but shaped by human reality, which is always more complicated than regulations anticipate. In many parts of the country, the presence of German prisoners was controversial. Some communities were openly hostile. Some families had sons or brothers or husbands fighting in Europe, and the idea of feeding and paying German soldiers while those men were in danger was not an abstraction. It was a daily grievance. The prisoner labor program required constant negotiation with that grievance. And yet, the accounts that survive from both sides describe something that neither pure hostility nor pure warmth quite captures. Individual farmers and individual prisoners, thrown together by the machinery of wartime necessity, sometimes found a human register that cut across the war. A farmer who was initially furious about the program would find, 3 weeks in, that the German who worked his field knew how to handle a plow. A prisoner who had arrived with contempt for American civilians would find that the farmer treated him without cruelty. Not with warmth, necessarily. Without cruelty. These were not friendships. They should not be romanticized. The power differential was absolute. One man wore a uniform and went home at night. The other was counted and locked in. But they were human encounters, and they left marks on both sides. Several former prisoners, interviewed decades later, named a specific American farmer, a specific farm, a specific stretch of American countryside, as the place where their mental image of the enemy finally gave way. That is a remarkable thing. To have your enemy become not a friend, but a person. To have the propaganda dissolve not in a grand political moment, but in the ordinary texture of shared physical labor. By 1944 and into 1945, the prisoners who had been in the United States long enough were watching the war's trajectory from inside the country that was winning it. News came through, censored, fragmented, unreliable, but the broad shape was visible. The Allied landings in Normandy in June 1944, the advance across France, the news from the Eastern Front, which had been catastrophic for Germany since Stalingrad in early 1943. A prisoner who had arrived in 1943 believing in German victory was, by late 1944, holding that belief against mounting evidence that required increasingly creative interpretation. Some men in the camps maintained their faith in Hitler and German victory with a persistence that was, in retrospect, a form of psychological self-protection. To admit that Germany was going to lose was also to admit that everything that losing implied, the deaths, the destruction, the moral reckoning, had been for nothing. That was an admission that a man might not be capable of making while the war was still ongoing. But the admission came. For some men it came before the German surrender on May 8, 1945. For others it came with the surrender itself, when the news reached the camps and the prisoners had to process, in the middle of American fields and American mess halls, that the country they had fought for no longer existed in the form they had known. The accounts of that moment are quiet. Men describe sitting very still. Men describe not speaking. One former prisoner recalled that what he felt was not grief and not relief but something closer to a vast emptiness, the space where certainty had been. What happened after the war ended to the German prisoners in the United States was shaped by logistical and political realities. Repatriation, sending the men home, took time. Germany in 1945 was a destroyed, occupied, chaotic country, and the process of returning hundreds of thousands of prisoners was not simple or quick. Many men remained in the United States into 1946, continuing to work, continuing to observe, continuing to accumulate the material of a reckoning they would carry home. When they arrived back in Germany, they were returning to rubble. The country they had left was gone, and they brought with them a particular kind of knowledge, not political analysis, not strategic insight, but the lived, granular, sensory knowledge of what the country that had defeated Germany actually looked like from the inside. The picture they carried was not flattering to the ideology they had served. A Germany that had gone to war partly on the premise that America was decadent and weak, had been beaten by a country whose farms they had harvested, whose roads they had ridden, whose food they had eaten, and whose governance, imperfect, contested, often hypocritical in its treatment of its own citizens, had nonetheless honored an international legal framework with sufficient consistency that hundreds of thousands of enemy prisoners had been kept alive, compensated, and returned home. That is not a small thing. It is, in its way, an extraordinary thing, and the men who came back knew it. The accounts that survive, the interviews, the memoirs, the letters written decades later when the political pressure to perform certain beliefs had faded, carry a recurring note. It is not admiration exactly. It is not affection. It is something quieter and more honest than either of those. It is the confession that the picture had been wrong. The men who had been told America was soft admitted that the softness they had expected was not what they found. They found organization. They found abundance. They found a country that was, in the middle of fighting the largest war in human history, still capable of treating its prisoners with a degree of regularity and decency that forced a revision of the mental model. They found, in short, an enemy that was stronger than they had been told, and more human than the ideology had permitted them to believe. One of the most consistent observations in prisoner accounts is not about military hardware or economic output. It is about the ordinary texture of American civilian life as they glimpsed it from the fields and the road, the houses, the cars, the grocery stores in the towns they passed through. The sense of a country that was not being consumed by the war in the way that Germany was being consumed. A country that was absorbing the costs and continuing. Imagine what that looked like through the window of a truck in 1944 if you were a man who had been told this country was about to lose. This is the story of what the enemy admitted. Not in the moment of surrender, but in the years of quiet work that preceded it. In the 80 cents a day. In the harvest they brought in for a country that had defeated them. In the letters written carefully, by candlelight, to families in a Germany that was already burning. The war was won in factories and on beaches and in the air. But it was also won in the mind of a prisoner sitting in a Texas field, looking out at a country that simply refused to be what he had been promised it would be. That is what the enemy admitted, and that is why it still matters. If this story stayed with you, if there is something in the image of a man revising everything he believed while harvesting an enemy's crops, then you already know why this channel exists. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because every week we tell the war through the eyes of those who lost it. Hit the like button if you think this kind of history deserves to be heard, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We read every one. We'll see you in the next one.